June 1972, Pennsylvania. The summer had arrived early that year, and it had arrived wet. May had been unusually sodden across the mid-Atlantic states, not dramatically, not in the way that makes headlines, but persistently, relentlessly, the kind of gray drizzle that soaks into the ground week after week until the soil stops absorbing it, and the water table rises to meet the surface and the rivers run higher than they should for the time of year. By the first week of June, the Susquehanna River, the longest river on the East Coast, a slow, wide, brown-green presence that winds through the heart of Pennsylvania from the New York border south toward the Chesapeake Bay, was already running above its normal June level. Not at flood stage, just high, just full. Nobody paid much attention to this. Pennsylvania had always been wet in spring. In the Wyoming Valley, a long, narrow basin carved into the Appalachian ridges of northeastern Pennsylvania, the cities of Wilkes-Barre and Kingston sat on either side of the Susquehanna, connected by bridges, bound by industry, what remained of it. The coal mines that had built these cities, that had pulled hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Poland and Ireland and Wales into these valleys across a century of extraction, were by 1972 mostly exhausted or abandoned. The Wyoming Valley was a Rust Belt community in the precise and literal sense, a place whose economic foundation had eroded beneath it, whose young people were leaving for Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or New York, whose remaining residents had stayed because their families were here, because the houses were cheap, because this was where they were from, and leaving felt like a different kind of defeat. They had, at least, the dike. In the 1940s, following devastating floods in 1936 that had killed hundreds across Pennsylvania, the United States Army Corps of Engineers constructed an elaborate system of levees and dikes along the Susquehanna through the Wyoming Valley. The Wilkes-Barre dike, a long, earthen and concrete structure running along the riverbank, had been designed to hold the river back up to a specific height. It had been tested by floods in the decades since its construction. It had held. The people of Wilkes-Barre had learned, across 30 years, to trust it. Down in Florida, on June 14th, a disturbance in the atmosphere over the Yucatan Peninsula organized itself into a tropical depression. By June 18th, it had crossed into the Gulf of Mexico and briefly achieved hurricane status, maximum sustained winds of 85 miles per hour, Category 1, the lowest rung of the hurricane scale. The National Hurricane Center tracked it. The Weather Bureau issued advisories. Coastal communities from the Florida Panhandle northward prepared for rough weather. The newspapers described it accurately. Agnes was not a powerful storm. It was wide. Its circulation spanned roughly 1,150 miles in diameter. One of the broadest Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded, but width is not the same as strength, and the forecasts were clear that Agnes would weaken rapidly once it moved inland. A Category 1 hurricane making landfall in Florida in June, tracking up the East Coast, losing organization and intensity as it crossed land. This was a manageable event. A wet weekend. Something to board up the windows for and then clean up after. The forecasters were correct about nearly everything. Agnes did make landfall at the Florida Panhandle on June 19th and weaken almost immediately. It crossed Georgia and the Carolinas as a tropical storm, then as something weaker still, producing rainfall but no catastrophic winds, no storm surge, no dramatic headline destruction. It moved up the coast in a way that confirmed every forecast. By the time it reached the mid-Atlantic states, it was being described in weather bulletins as a remnant low, the degraded circulatory remnant of a storm that had, for all practical purposes, already died. What the forecasts did not, could not, given the state of atmospheric modeling in 1972, predict was what Agnes would do next. Over Pennsylvania and New York, the remnant circulation of Agnes encountered a separate extratropical low-pressure system moving in from the west. The two systems did not cancel each other out. They merged. They locked together over the Appalachian Plateau in a configuration that neither forecasting model nor historical precedent had adequately prepared the region's emergency managers to anticipate, and they stalled. The combined system simply stopped moving, hanging over the watershed of the Susquehanna River basin like a fixed fixture in the sky, drawing moisture up from the Atlantic and releasing it over the same geography, hour after hour, across multiple days. Between June 20th and June 24th, rainfall across central Pennsylvania ranged from 8 to 10 inches across the broad watershed and reached isolated peaks of 15 to 18 inches in the Harrisburg area over a single 2-4-hour period. 14 trillion gallons of water fell on Pennsylvania. 14 trillion gallons. onto ground that was already saturated, into rivers that were already running high, through a river valley system whose flood control infrastructure had been designed 30 years earlier for a different category of event entirely. The flash flood warning system that existed in the United States in 1972 had been built around a specific model of how dangerous rainfall events occur: intense, localized, short-duration events where a large amount of water falls in a small area in a brief period of time. It was good at detecting these events. It was less good, structurally, by design, at detecting the slow-motion accumulation of a basin-wide inundation event, where the danger came not from any single day's rainfall, but from the cumulative weight of days of moderate rain falling over the entire watershed of one of the longest river systems on the east coast. The Susquehanna River Basin drains an area of 27,500 square miles across Pennsylvania and New York. Every stream, every creek, every tributary in that entire area was running full by June 21st. And all of it, every drop from every hillside and hollow and farm field in 27,500 square miles of saturated terrain, was moving toward the same place, toward the Wyoming Valley, toward Wilkes-Barre, toward the dike. In the city itself, on the evening of June 22nd, people were watching the river. This was not unusual. Wilkes-Barre residents had a long and practiced relationship with the Susquehanna in flood, a relationship shaped by the dike that stood between them and it. The river was high, the river was rising, but the dike had held before, and the dike was there, and the forecasts, even the updated ones, even the ones that had begun to register the scale of what was accumulating upstream, had not yet communicated to the people of Wilkes-Barre the number that would change everything. The flood stage on the Susquehanna at Wilkes-Barre, the level at which the river is considered to be in flood, is 22 feet. The dike had been designed and built to hold the river to a specific height above that. What was coming downstream, in the darkness, fed by 14 trillion gallons of Pennsylvania rainfall, and the entire drainage of a river basin the size of a small country, would crest at 43 feet, 21 feet above flood stage, 8 feet higher than any flood recorded since 1865, 40% greater than the discharge of a 50-year flood event. A Category 1 hurricane doesn't need to be powerful. It only needs to be patient. There is a specific kind of institutional blindness that comes not from ignorance, but from design. The men and women who built the flood warning systems of the United States in the mid-20th century were not negligent. They were engineers and hydrologists and meteorologists of considerable skill, working with the tools and the data and the conceptual frameworks available to them. They built what they knew how to build. They designed for the events they had seen. And in 1972, what those systems were not designed to see, what they had no language for, no model for, no historical precedent sufficient to prepare them for, was a storm that had already died, delivering the worst flood in a century to a river valley 800 miles from where it made landfall. The National Hurricane Center had stopped tracking Agnes as a meaningful weather system by June 21st. It was, in the technical vocabulary of the forecasters, a remnant low, a post-tropical disturbance, the kind of system that shows up in the footnotes of hurricane season summaries as a notation that a storm had dissipated over land without significant further impact. The advisories had been discontinued, the hurricane warnings had been lifted. The coastal communities that had braced for Agnes had already begun their cleanup. Pennsylvania was not a coastal community. Pennsylvania was not in the hurricane advisories. Pennsylvania was where the storm went to die, except it didn't die. What happened over the Appalachian Plateau in the third week of June 1972 was, in the vocabulary of modern meteorology, a mesoscale convective interaction between a decaying tropical circulation and a mid-latitude baroclinic system, a collision of two atmospheric regimes that locked the moisture-laden remnant of Agnes over a fixed geography and turned it into a stationary rainfall engine. The tropical system carried enormous quantities of Gulf of Mexico moisture northward. The extratropical system provided the lifting mechanism that squeezed that moisture out of the atmosphere and dropped it, as rain, over the same river basin, again and again, for days. In 1972, there was no model that predicted this interaction with useful specificity. The operational forecast systems of the National Weather Service had not been built to track post-tropical remnants as hydrological threats. The River Forecast Centers, the offices responsible for predicting river levels and issuing flood warnings, received rainfall data from a network of gauging stations and rain gauges scattered across the watershed, but the network had gaps, and the computational tools available for translating rainfall data into river-level predictions were limited by both the density of the input data and the processing speed of the systems running the models. The Susquehanna River Basin Commission, the interstate body responsible for coordinating flood management across Pennsylvania and New York, had been established only in 1971. It was 1 year old, its staff and systems were new, its institutional relationships with state and local emergency managers were still being built. And beneath all of this, beneath every technical and institutional limitation, there was the dike. The Wyoming Valley Levee System had been constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1940s, following the catastrophic floods of 1936, when the Susquehanna had killed hundreds across Pennsylvania and left entire communities underwater for days. The 1940s dike was an engineering achievement appropriate to its era and its mandate. It was built to contain the Susquehanna at a level that the historical flood record, up to that point, suggested was a reasonable worst case. It was built to protect Wilkes-Barre from the kind of flood that had nearly destroyed it in 1936. It was not built for what was coming in June 1972. It had never been tested against a river running at 43 feet. On the evening of June 22nd, as Agnes's remnants continued to drop rain across the watershed and the Susquehanna continued its slow, inexorable rise, the river at Wilkes-Barre crossed flood stage. This was not unusual. The river at Wilkes-Barre crossed flood stage with some regularity in wet years. The dike's job was to hold it there to contain the excess, to keep the neighborhoods on the valley floor dry while the river ran high behind its earthen wall. Emergency managers in Luzerne County monitored the gauges. The river was rising faster than normal, faster than the models had projected as recently as 24 hours earlier. Revised forecasts began arriving from the river forecast centers, each one higher than the last, each one representing a recalibration as the upstream gauges reported data that the models had not anticipated. The forecasts were chasing the reality. The reality was moving faster. By the morning of June 23rd, the revised forecast called for the river to crest somewhere between 37 and 40 feet. This was alarming. This was above any flood on record in living memory. This was above the design capacity of sections of the levee system. Evacuation orders began to be issued for the lowest-lying neighborhoods in Wilkes-Barre, the streets closest to the river, the blocks that would go underwater first if the dike was overtopped. But 37 to 40 feet was not 43 feet. And the gap between those numbers, the gap between the worst forecast and the actual event, is where the city lived for the next 12 hours, making decisions based on information that was being revised upward faster than any emergency management system in 1972 could process and communicate. In Harrisburg, 60 miles south along the Susquehanna, the same process was playing out at a different scale. The state capital sat in the wide floodplain of the river, protected by its own levee system, home to the offices of state government and the mansion of the governor. By June 23rd, the Susquehanna at Harrisburg had overtopped its banks and was spreading across the low ground of the city. The governor's mansion, a gracious Victorian structure on the riverbank, took on water. Governor Milton Shapp moved his operations to higher ground and issued a statement that contained no ambiguity whatsoever. He called Agnes, without qualification, the worst disaster in the history of Pennsylvania. He was not wrong. He was just early. The worst part was still 12 hours away. Upstream, in the river valleys of central Pennsylvania, in the towns of Lock Haven and Sunbury and Bloomsburg, and a dozen smaller communities strung along the tributaries that fed the Susquehanna, the flooding had already been catastrophic for days. Entire neighborhoods had been underwater since June 21st. Streets had become channels. First floors had become swimming pools. The rivers in these communities had broken records that had stood since before living memory crests that exceeded the floods of 1,865 and 1,936, floods that the oldest residents had heard about as historical events on the scale of myths, floods that had defined the outer boundary of what the river could do. Agnes had exceeded all of them, and all that water, all of it, from every flooded valley and every broken tributary and every saturated hillside in 27,500 square miles of drenched Pennsylvania terrain was moving downstream, toward Wilkes-Barre, toward a dike that had held for 30 years and had never seen anything like this. In the city, on the night of June 23rd, some residents had evacuated. Others had not. Some had heard the warnings and decided the dike would hold, as it had always held, as it had been built to hold. Some had nowhere to go. Some were elderly, or sick, or without transportation, or caring for people who were. Some simply did not believe that the river, which they could see from their windows running high and brown and fast, but still behind the wall that had been put there to contain it, could become what the revised forecasts were now saying it would become. The dike had held for 30 years. It would not hold tonight. At approximately 1:00 inches the morning on the 24th of June, 1972, the Susquehanna River at Wilkes-Barre crested at 40.9 feet and kept rising. The dike had been designed and built with a specific margin above the anticipated worst-case flood level, a margin the Army Corps of Engineers had calculated as adequate based on the historical record available to them in the 1940s. That margin was gone now. The river was pressing against the top of the earthen wall with a weight and a volume that had no precedent in the dike's 30-year history. Emergency crews had been working through the night along the levee's length, monitoring for seepage, watching for the subtle signs of structural compromise, the small springs of water appearing at the base of the earthen wall on the dry side, the slight but unmistakable movement of soil that precedes a catastrophic breach. They found them. They sandbagged. They worked by flashlight in the rain, which was still falling, which had been falling for 4 days without meaningful interruption, and the river behind the wall was not a passive presence. It was a pressure. It was the accumulated weight of 14 trillion gallons of Pennsylvania rainfall pressing against 30-year-old earth and concrete and asking a simple question. The dike answered just before dawn, not with a dramatic explosion, not with a single catastrophic moment of structural failure that announced itself with a sound and a spectacle. It failed the way earthen structures under hydrostatic pressure tend to fail progressively. The water finding the weakest point and enlarging it, the breach beginning small and widening faster than any human response could address it. First, a seep became a stream. Then the stream became a river of its own, running backward from the Susquehanna side to the city side through a gap in the wall that grew wider by the minute. The sirens went off across Wilkes-Barre at approximately 3 a.m., in the darkness, in the rain, in neighborhoods where some people were sleeping and some were watching from upstairs windows and some were already in their cars trying to get out. The sound of the emergency sirens combined with something else, a low, rushing sound, that residents on the streets nearest the river described as resembling the sound of a fast-moving stream, growing louder, getting closer, and then the water was in the street, and it was not trickling or seeping, but moving with the purposeful velocity of a river that had found a new channel and intended to use it. The water was brown. It was cold. It carried with it the debris of everything that had already flooded upstream branches, boards, furniture, the contents of basements from communities 60 miles north that had been underwater for 3 days already. It moved through the ground floor streets of Wilkes-Barre at a pace that a person could walk ahead of, then could jog ahead of, and then could not outrun if they had left it too late and were on foot on a street that was already ankle-deep and becoming knee-deep and becoming waist-deep faster than the body's instincts were calibrated to process. In the neighborhoods closest to the breach, the water reached the second floor of single-story homes before it stopped rising. In the lowest areas of the Wyoming Valley floor, the streets that sat in the flattest, most river-adjacent parts of the basin, it was deeper still. Cars were submerged to their roofs. The traffic lights at intersections hung above the waterline, still cycling through green and yellow and red for streets that no longer existed as streets. More than 100,000 people in the Wilkes-Barre metropolitan area were ultimately evacuated, some before the breach, some during it, some pulled from second-floor windows and rooftops by National Guard boats and civilian volunteers in the hours and days that followed. It was, in terms of the number of people displaced from a single metropolitan area in a single event, one of the largest domestic evacuations in American history to that point. The Susquehanna crested, finally, at 43 feet. 43 feet. Against a flood stage of 22 feet, against a previous record, set in 1936, that this flood exceeded by 8 feet, against a 50-year flood discharge that Agnes exceeded by 40%, against the design specifications of a dike that had been built when 43 feet was not a number anyone had reason to imagine. 60 miles south, Harrisburg was underwater. The Pennsylvania state capital, a city of 68,000 people, home to the state legislature, to the offices of every state agency, to the infrastructure of government that would be needed to respond to the disaster now consuming the Commonwealth had been flooding since June 22nd. By June 24th, the water in the low-lying sections of the city was deep enough to move through by boat. The governor's mansion, the gracious Victorian structure where Governor Milton Shapp had been coordinating the state's response, had taken on several feet of water in its ground floor. The governor had relocated his emergency operations center to higher ground before the flooding reached its peak, but the image, the chief executive's residence of one of the largest states in the nation sitting in the middle of what had been its lawn, surrounded by brown floodwater, the flags on its facade limp and wet above the waterline, captured something essential about what Agnes had done to Pennsylvania. It had not respected anything, not the dike, not the governor's mansion, not the state capitol, not the newspapers. On the 23rd of June, 1972, the Harrisburg Patriot News did not publish. It was the first time in 120 years since 1852 that the paper had failed to produce an edition. The presses were flooded. The building was flooded. The staff had been evacuated. The newspaper that had covered the Civil War, both world wars, the Great Depression, and every flood and disaster Pennsylvania had endured across a century and a quarter of continuous publication, could not get a paper out that morning because the Susquehanna was in the building. In Elmira, New York, just north of the Pennsylvania border, 20,000 people had been evacuated as the Chemung River overtopped its banks and spread across the city. The flooding in Elmira was, in the judgment of the officials who assessed it, the worst the city had experienced since a catastrophic flood in 1935. Streets that had been dry through every storm in living memory were under 5 feet of water. In Corning, New York, home to the Corning Museum of Glass, one of the most significant collections of decorative glass in the world, the Chemung River inundated the museum's ground floor to a depth of several feet, destroying or damaging thousands of irreplaceable objects that had survived the better part of a century in that building without incident. In Binghamton, in Kingston, in York and Lancaster, and a dozen smaller Pennsylvania communities strung along the tributaries of the Susquehanna. In Maryland, where the river system continued south toward the Chesapeake. In Virginia, 12 states received federal disaster declarations. President Richard Nixon, who was, in June of 1972, in the midst of a re-election campaign and the early stages of what would become the Watergate scandal, toured the disaster zone by helicopter on June 24th and declared Agnes the worst natural disaster in American history. He was photographed standing in a flooded street in Wilkes-Barre in dress shoes and a suit, the water around his ankles, looking at what the river had done to a city of 60,000 people who had trusted a wall. On the ground, in the days immediately after the flooding peaked, the scale of what Agnes had deposited was not immediately comprehensible. The floodwaters receded slowly. The Susquehanna, even after cresting, took days to drop back below flood stage, days during which the streets of Wilkes-Barre and Harrisburg and 100 smaller communities remained inaccessible by any means other than boat. When the water finally withdrew, it left behind not the clean aftermath of a flash flood, not standing water draining away to reveal wet but largely intact streets, but the accumulated sediment and debris of an entire river basin in flood. Mud. Everywhere. Mud brown, thick, pervasive, coating every surface the water had touched, filling the basements of 64,000 homes and businesses across Pennsylvania alone, embedding itself in the foundations of structures that would take months or years to make habitable again, if they were made habitable at all. The smell of it, wet earth and river silt, and the particular organic decay of everything the water had touched and left behind, would stay in the memory of everyone who lived through those days for the rest of their lives. A relief worker deployed to Wilkes-Barre in the days after the flood described arriving in the city by National Guard truck and not being able to identify, from the road, which neighborhood she was in. The street signs were underwater or had been knocked over or were buried in debris. The landmarks she had known were either submerged or unrecognizable beneath their coating of brown silt. The city she had known was there, the buildings were there, most of them, but it had been rendered unreadable, stripped of the visual language that makes a known place familiar. She said it looked like the city had been turned off. And in the silence of a June morning in the Wyoming Valley, with the river still running brown and fast and the mud still wet and the sirens quiet now because there was nothing left for them to warn about, that description was exactly right. The storm that nobody had feared had done what the storms that everybody feared had never managed to do. It had turned Pennsylvania off. In the days after the Susquehanna crested, the federal government moved. President Nixon signed disaster declarations for 5 states within 72 hours of the peak flooding: Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Virginia, and Florida. The National Guard was already deployed across the Wyoming Valley, moving through the flooded streets of Wilkes-Barre and Kingston by boat, pulling people from second-floor windows, delivering food and water to neighborhoods that had been cut off since the breach. The Red Cross opened emergency shelters in schools and churches on the high ground above the valley floor. Volunteers arrived from across the state and then from across the country to help with the work that comes after a flood recedes, and that is, in many ways, harder than surviving the flood itself. The work of the mud. In Wilkes-Barre alone, more than 64,000 homes and businesses had been damaged or destroyed. The word damaged, in the context of Agnes, required qualification. A house that had taken 4 feet of water in its ground floor, which described tens of thousands of structures in the Wyoming Valley, was not damaged in the sense of needing repair. It was damaged in the sense that everything inside it, from the floor to a height of 4 feet, had been submerged in brown river water carrying silt and sewage and industrial runoff, and the dissolved contents of every flooded basement and septic system upstream for 60 miles. The furniture was ruined. The walls had absorbed the water into their framing. The insulation, where it existed, was saturated and had become a medium for mold that would begin growing within days if the structure was not completely gutted and dried. Most families did not have flood insurance. The National Flood Insurance Program had existed since 1968, but in 1972 it was still in its early years and its participation rates were low, particularly in inland communities far from the coast, where the conventional wisdom held that flooding was a riverine problem managed by the Army Corps of Engineers and its levee systems, rather than a risk that individual homeowners needed to insure against. The dike was supposed to make flood insurance unnecessary. The dike was supposed to be the insurance. When the dike failed, the families of Wilkes-Barre discovered that they were holding mortgages on homes that were unlivable, that they could not sell, that would cost more to restore than they were worth on the pre-flood market, and that they had no insurance coverage for any of it. The federal disaster assistance available to individual homeowners in 1972 was limited and slow. The Small Business Administration offered low-interest disaster loans, an instrument designed for businesses that had been applied, imperfectly, to residential disaster recovery since the 1950s. The loans required creditworthiness. They required collateral. They required a homeowner to demonstrate the ability to repay a debt taken on to restore a home that the flood had made worthless as collateral. For the working class and retired residents of the Wyoming Valley people who had spent their lives in a coal country economy that had been declining for decades, whose homes represented not an investment but a place to live, whose savings had not been large even before the flood took the contents of their basements, the machinery of federal disaster assistance was a form of bureaucracy designed for a different kind of victim in a different kind of place. Sharon Mears, a bureau case worker deployed to Luzerne County in the weeks after the flooding, described the work of the relief effort in terms that said everything about the gap between the institutional response and the human reality it was supposed to address. She said there was a lot of crying, a lot of patting on the shoulder. That came first. Then they tried to answer the needs. The trying was genuine. The answering was inadequate, not because the people doing the work were indifferent. By every account they were not, but because the scale of what Agnes had done to Pennsylvania exceeded every framework that existed for responding to it. The state had never had a disaster of this magnitude. The federal government had never deployed disaster assistance at this scale to an inland flooding event. The protocols, the funding mechanisms, the staffing levels, the supply chains, all of them had been built for something smaller. And Agnes was not something smaller. Across the 12 states that received disaster declarations, the accounting was staggering. More than 117 confirmed deaths, 50 of them in Pennsylvania alone. In Pennsylvania and New Jersey combined, approximately 43,594 structures were destroyed or significantly damaged. Total damage across all affected states reached $3.1 billion in 1972 dollars, the equivalent of more than $21 billion in contemporary value. Property damage in Pennsylvania alone accounted for $2.1 billion of that total. It was, by the measure of every financial metric available, the most destructive hurricane in American history up to that point. And Agnes, at its peak, had been a Category 1. This fact, this single, stubborn, deeply counterintuitive fact became the central paradox of the Agnes disaster and the engine of everything that changed in its aftermath. The Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale, which categorized hurricanes from 1 to 5 based on sustained wind speed, was the primary instrument through which the American public and American emergency management understood hurricane risk. Category 5 meant catastrophe. Category 1 meant manageable. The scale was accurate as far as it went. Wind speed is a real and meaningful measure of a hurricane's destructive potential at and near the coast. But Agnes had not killed with wind. Agnes had not even been a hurricane when it killed most of its victims. Agnes had killed with rain, with the slow, patient, geometrically inevitable process of dumping more water onto a watershed than the watershed's rivers could carry. And the scale that was supposed to tell Americans how afraid to be had said, right up until the dike broke, that Agnes was the least scary kind of storm. In Elmira, New York, where 20,000 people had been evacuated, the community faced a recovery that would take years. Entire neighborhoods had to be condemned. The economic damage to a city that was already struggling like Wilkes-Barre, living with the long decline of the industrial economy that had built it, compounded loss upon loss in ways that would not fully resolve for a decade. In Corning, New York, the flooding of the Corning Museum of Glass had destroyed or damaged thousands of objects. The museum's collection glass pieces that had survived wars and depressions and every flood in the building's history had been sitting in several feet of Chemung River water. The recovery of the collection became one of the largest and most technically complex museum salvage operations in American history to that point, requiring conservators and specialists and volunteers working for months to assess, clean, and stabilize objects that the water had touched. In the Wyoming Valley, the human recovery moved at the pace that human recoveries always move faster in some places than others, determined by resources and luck, and the particular resilience of individual families and communities in the face of losses that no external assistance could fully replace. Some families rebuilt, some sold what remained of their properties at a loss and left the valley, adding their departures to the long demographic erosion that the coal economy's decline had already set in motion. Some stayed in temporary housing for months, in trailers and shelters and the spare rooms of relatives on higher ground, waiting for money that came slowly and houses that took longer. Nixon's helicopter tour of Wilkes-Barre had been photographed and broadcast nationally. The image of the President of the United States standing ankle-deep in the flooded street of an American city, in a suit, looking at the mud, that image did something to the national understanding of what a hurricane could do that 100 meteorological briefings had not. It made the invisible visible. Agnes had moved inland and disappeared from the hurricane advisories and killed more people and destroyed more property than storms that had terrified the coastlines. It had done this while being classified, at its most dangerous moment, as something that had already stopped being a hurricane. It had done this in states that did not think of themselves as hurricane states, to people who did not think of themselves as hurricane victims, through a mechanism inland flooding from a decayed tropical system that the warning systems and the insurance systems and the disaster response systems of the United States had not been built to address. The accounting was done. The mud was drying. And in the offices of the National Weather Service, in the conference rooms of FEMA's predecessor agencies, in the halls of Congress where the disaster appropriations were being debated, the question that Agnes had made unavoidable was finally being asked. How had a Category 1 hurricane just become the worst natural disaster in American history? And what were they going to do to make sure the answer was never the same again? The mud dried slowly. In the Wyoming Valley, in the summer of 1972, it dried in layers, the surface crust hardening in the July heat, while the deeper deposit stayed wet and dark and soft, the way river silt always does, holding its moisture long after everything around it has returned to the appearance of normalcy. Residents who returned to their homes to begin the work of gutting the ground floors found the mud inside their walls, inside their insulation, inside the framing timber. In places, the water had reached that no amount of surface cleaning could address. The smell of it, that particular combination of river sediment and organic decay and something harder to name, the smell of a life's accumulation of objects touched by floodwater and changed into something else, stayed in those houses for months. Some families said it never entirely left. The physical recovery of the Wyoming Valley took years, not months, years. More than 64,000 structures had been damaged or destroyed across Pennsylvania alone. The process of assessing, demolishing, repairing, and rebuilding at that scale in a region that was already economically fragile, in a country whose disaster assistance infrastructure had been exposed by Agnes as inadequate to events of this magnitude, did not move quickly. Federal money came, but it came through mechanisms that had not been designed for this. State money came, but Pennsylvania had not budgeted for a disaster of this scale. The Small Business Administration processed loan applications from homeowners who in many cases had no realistic ability to repay them, and the processing was slow, and the approvals were inconsistent, and the gap between what people needed and what the system could provide was wide and remained wide for a long time. The Wyoming Valley levee system, the dike that had failed, was rebuilt. The Army Corps of Engineers returned to the valley and redesigned the system with a higher design capacity, incorporating the 4-3-foot crest of Agnes into the new calculations as a baseline rather than an outlier. The rebuilt levee was completed years after the flood, at a cost that dwarfed the original construction. It has held since. The Susquehanna has risen close to Agnes levels on subsequent occasions, most notably during Tropical Storm Lee in 2011. When the river at Wilkes-Barre crested at 42.66 feet, within inches of the Agnes record, and the rebuilt levee held under what engineers described as extreme stress, the dike held. But the memory of the night it didn't. The memory that runs through the Wyoming Valley like a watermark, visible to anyone who knows how to look, has never entirely left. Agnes changed things. Not immediately, not cleanly, not with the decisive institutional transformation that disasters sometimes produce in the legislative histories of the agencies responsible for preventing them. Change after Agnes moved the way, recovery moved slowly, unevenly, driven by the accumulated pressure of a disaster that had made too many failures visible to be entirely ignored. The National Flood Insurance Program, which had existed since 1968 with low participation rates and limited reach, was significantly reformed and expanded in the years after Agnes. Congress passed the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973, which required property owners in identified flood hazard areas to purchase flood insurance as a condition of receiving federally backed mortgages. The participation rates that had been negligible before Agnes began to climb. The map of identified flood hazard areas expanded. The recognition that flooding, including inland flooding from tropical systems, was a risk that could not be managed solely through structural flood control began, slowly, to reshape how the federal government approached the problem. The National Weather Service began, in the years after Agnes, to develop new tools for tracking the hydrological consequences of tropical systems after they made landfall and weakened. The concept of the post-tropical remnant as a significant rainfall threat, the recognition that a storm which had ceased to be a hurricane in any meaningful meteorological sense could still deliver catastrophic flooding hundreds of miles from the coast days after making landfall, became a formal part of how forecasters communicated risk. The advisories changed. The language changed. The institutional memory of Agnes, of a Category 1 storm that had become the worst natural disaster in American history, became a recurring reference point in the training of a generation of meteorologists and emergency managers. The Saffir-Simpson scale itself did not change. It still runs from 1 to 5. It still measures wind speed. It still, in the public mind, functions as the primary indicator of how afraid to be when a hurricane is named and tracked and assigned a category. This is both accurate and insufficient accurate, because wind speed at landfall is a real and meaningful measure of coastal destructive potential. Insufficient, because Agnes demonstrated with brutal clarity that a storm's category at landfall tells you almost nothing about what it will do to the rivers of the interior once it has moved ashore and stalled and begun the slow work of emptying itself over a watershed. Every major inland flooding disaster from Agnes onward, from the floods associated with Hurricane Floyd in 1999, which killed more people through inland flooding than through any other mechanism, to the catastrophic rainfall of Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which dropped 60 inches of rain on parts of the Houston metropolitan area and killed 107 people while making landfall as a Category 4 storm, but doing its greatest damage as a stalled, rain-producing remnant carries within it the ghost of Agnes. The same mechanism. The same gap between the category and the consequence. The same populations living in the interior of the country, far from the coast, who did not think of themselves as hurricane victims and were not warned with the urgency that their actual risk warranted. In Wilkes-Barre, on the riverbank above the rebuilt levee, there is a flood gauge, a measuring staff fixed to a structure on the bank of the Susquehanna, marked with water levels going back decades. The 4-3-foot mark is there. It has a date next to it, June 1972. Every year, when the spring rains come and the snowmelt runs off the Appalachian Plateau and the Susquehanna begins its seasonal rise, that mark is visible from the bank, a fixed notation in the physical landscape of the city, a reminder that the river has been that high before, and that the thing standing between the city and a recurrence of it is a rebuilt wall that has, so far, held. So far, the Wyoming Valley is still there. The cities are still there, smaller than they were in 1972. Still carrying the dual weight of the coal economy's long decline and the flood's long aftermath, but present, inhabited, going about the business of existing in a river valley in Pennsylvania. The Susquehanna still runs through it, wide and brown in the spring, lower and clearer in the dry months of late summer, indifferent to the cities on its banks, in the way that rivers are always indifferent to the cities on their banks. Agnes is still the benchmark. The word that old-timers in the Wyoming Valley use when they want to convey the scale of a flood event, when they want to tell someone younger what bad looks like, is not a number. It is a name, Agnes, they say. It was Agnes bad. No one who was there in June 1972 needs that explained. Across 12 states, 128 people died, 50 of them in Pennsylvania. 14 trillion gallons of water fell from a storm that had already, by every formal meteorological classification, stopped being a storm. The most destructive hurricane in American history at that point in time had maximum sustained winds, at its peak, of 85 miles per hour, barely enough to qualify as a hurricane at all. It did not destroy the Wyoming Valley with wind. It destroyed it with patience, with the slow, geometric, utterly indifferent accumulation of water in a watershed that had nowhere left to put it, rising in the rivers, pressing against the walls, finding the weak point in a dike that 30 years of held floods had made everyone trust completely. The lesson of Agnes is not complicated. It does not require advanced meteorology or hydrology or systems analysis to understand. It requires only the recognition that the number assigned to a storm at the moment it crosses the coastline is a measure of one kind of danger, and that the interior of a continent, the river valleys and the cities built in them and the people who live there because that is where they are from, faces a different kind of danger entirely, one that has no category, one that does not announce itself with a number, one that arrives, as Agnes arrived, wearing the label of something manageable and becomes, in the silence of a June night in Pennsylvania, something that has no label adequate to it at all. The Susquehanna is still there, and so is the 4-3 foot mark.